On behalf of Chris, let me thank all of you for being here for that very warm welcome. And I want to stipulate that I was not asked to be the interviewer merely because my last name is Kennedy. Although I suppose it doesn't hurt. Chris was just joking. This is a gathering of the ancient order of Hibernians right here on the stage. So, Chris, I have to say, with the tongue only partly in cheek, that as I was reading your fine book, I occasionally was put in mind of Edmund Morris's biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch, in which Morris inserts himself as a fictional character in the lifetime of Ronald Reagan. You're not a fictional character, but one of the characteristics of your book that I found actually quite engaging was that you appear in various pages, remembering where you were at a certain moment and so on. It gives the book a really nice, warm, personal touch, in my view. Why did you decide to do it that way?
I think I was pushed to do it, but also by the publisher, but also because I lived it, and I've been following politics since I was very young, and I remember the Army McCarthy hearings on television at home. I remember the Eisenhower campaign in '52. I remember certainly the '60 campaign between Kennedy and Nixon, and I went through it all: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. I think I paid attention to the big fight with Big Steel, and all the civil rights fights, and I wanted to say where I was when Bobby was killed. I was in Montreal, and turning on the radio at 2 or 3 in the morning and realizing, my God, this isn't a replay, because I thought it was. I thought it was a reprise of what had happened in Dallas, and I wanted to capture that. And the confession lines, I think I may have mentioned that at Catholic colleges when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, the fear that this was the end. It was real, and it wasn't funny at the time, I got to tell you, those who remember it. It was real. This was a close call. And I think Bobby, in that incident, had a tremendously positive role to get us through it. So I wanted to talk about, I'm 20 years younger than Bobby Kennedy. If he were alive today, he'd be 92. It's possible he could have lived this long if he hadn't been killed. I think he was pretty healthy, and I think, I know that, first of all, the quick answer, despite the Kennedy wealth and prestige, being an Irish Catholic kid is very similar regardless of how much money your old man makes. We lived with the church conversations about Notre Dame, which they had a terrible Saturday last week with Miami. We worried about Father Feeney, the priest that said no salvation outside the church. I remember the nuns saying, here's a page you can't quote from in the poetry page because Father Feeney wrote it. I remember the nuns that said, when the nun announced that Stalin had just died, and she said to pray, and I've been wondering ever since that moment, for what? Was it we were glad? Was it for him to have sort of a Dutch Schultz conversion at the last minute? We always talked about the Jewish guy that had the conversion at the end. Or was it we're just glad or whatever? I don't know, to go to hell. Maybe that was what we were praying for. I could never figure it out. They never told us what we were praying for. Just let us pray. And I lived through all this stuff. So that's the long answer. And I just, I wanted to show that I was there.
So for the record, Chris, isn't it the case you're only half Irish?
Well, actually, my mom, you are your mom. Come on, give me this. Give the mom the credit. You are your mom. My mom was Mary Shields, Teresa Shields, and she was a Shields, and they came from Donegal, and also the Quinlans, and the Quinlans and the Conroys. That whole side's all Irish Catholic. My grandmother on the other side was from Antrim, spoke with an Irish brogue all the time we were growing up, and she was Protestant. She was an Orange woman, and you're right. My grandfather on my dad's side is from England. He was an immigrant, but enough. I'm Irish enough. And if I ever do a book, I'm going to call it that, because you don't want to be too Irish. You go off the cliff with that, and it's not just the booze. There's something really crazy about being Irish, and I think I got enough of it.
Well, I'll tell you, I was once introduced to a girl.
And by the way, you 100% now that you've got up there on the pedestal?
I'm going to tell you the story.
All right.
I was once introduced to a girlfriend's grandmother in Winchester, Massachusetts. You know what I'm talking about. It's a deep wasp stronghold. And I was introduced to this elderly lady, and then she went off a few steps, but I could still hear her. She says to her granddaughter, my girlfriend, What'd you say that boy's name was? And she said, Kennedy. Well, isn't that an Irish name? He said, yes, he's 100%. And the grandma said, well, he seemed like a nice boy anyway.
There's a lot of that in the book, but as you know. There's a lot of that Yankee attitude in the book. No Irish need apply. And at Holy Cross, they came up with that one where the Cabots speak only to God. It was a Holy Cross. I went to Holy Cross, which is the wall-to-wall Irish college in Massachusetts. No. Can we get off this subject? I don't think everybody here's Irish or wants to hear this palaver.
Let's stick with you just a little bit more.
This palaver.
You tee yourself up by putting yourself in the book, so this is legitimate. So how do you write? How do you find the time, given all the other things that you do?
When I do the research, I do a lot of that. I mean, I do it all. And I collect string, collect it over time. And I basically have 4 rules of writing, which I always tell people, you can write if you... Anybody wants to write, I'll tell you to write, because that's how I do it. You throw it on the page. You just get it on there. Each chapter, everything you can think of that you think should be in the book, everything you come across, everything you've underlined. I'm a big underliner. I love to underline even oral histories. So I collect everything, and then I organize it. Chronologically, it's the safest thing. Stephen Ambrose says, he said, depart from chronology at your peril. And chronology is a good organizing principle, as you know, in history. And then the third thing is I rough it, then I polish it. And I try to stick to those rules. And the trick is to always know what you're doing. Because inevitably your writer's block comes, well, you know this, when you're in one stage, which is collecting, organizing, roughing, or polishing. And you start to polish it, you start worrying about the first sentence when you're still collecting. Or you get confused. But you always say, what am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? Okay, you'll be all right. Just stick to that stage. And then find an editor to help clean it up at the end. I mean, I'm not saying I write columns by myself. I write all my own stuff on television, but, you know, I have an editor that helps me. She screams at me. Why are you writing like you're on television? Why are you writing in sentences instead of paragraphs? And she's about this high and frightening.
Is she Irish?
No, she's Jewish, obviously. You want somebody smarter than you to help you. You don't want somebody stupider than you to help you.
So what time of day do you write? Morning, noon, night?
You're into the problem area with my wife right now. She calls it that room. And she doesn't like it. And this is not a joke. She does not like this book thing because I'm working 50, 60 hours on the show. So I take the rest of the time out of the family. I don't do exercise. I don't play golf. I don't play the piano, even though I got a brand new Steinway. I don't practice the piano. I don't do what I should be doing. I get up early Saturday and I say, I got to stay. I got to work. And I do it on Sunday and I do it at night. I stayed awake till I can't stay awake any longer. That's one of the tricks of my business is to stay awake till you fall asleep 3 or 4 times. And after about the 3rd or 4th time falling asleep, you agree to go to sleep. But getting up at 6, I mean, I know Richard Reeves, the historian, used to have this thing where he would say, no coffee till you've written a certain amount every morning. You know, you got to write an hour before I'm going to even have a cup of coffee. You force yourself to be productive. But you know, what you do is fear. Yes, how do you write? You make like Jack Kennedy used to say, throw a cap over the wall. So you have to go over the wall to get the cap. And you say, all right, you tell Simon & Schuster, I'll have the book by May of next year. And you better. You're contractually determined to do it. And I get it done. And I'm a great writer on deadline. I love to, fear works for me. And I recommend it. I recommend deadlines. And luckily, I know a lot to start with. And that helps. And I just know a lot. I don't forget history. I forget keys. I forget where the car's parked. But I remember the stuff that you're a professor of. I just happen to remember it, and I love it. I love anything that happened since World War II. I'm fanatical about.
So, Chris, this is not your first book, nor is it your first book about Kennedy.
That's right.
And the last time you and I had a conversation like this one here in Palo Alto, we were talking about your book on John F. Kennedy. And you include as the epigrams to one of your chapters in this book the following quote from Arthur M. Schlesinger, who's also, you share with him, you're both biographers of the Kennedys.
That's great.
And Schlesinger said the following, in one of his characteristically pithy remarks. He said, John Kennedy was a realist brilliantly disguised as a romantic, and Robert Kennedy, a romantic stubbornly disguised as a realist.
No, it's so true. It's the great revelation of all the work I've done is to find out that Jack Kennedy, and this is intuitive with everybody knows this. You know that the most compelling, most attractive people, the most alluring people tend to be secretly unneedy of you. They don't need you. And this is certainly true in movies. It's Orson Welles in The Third Man. It's almost every character you can think of. It's alluring. There are people that clearly don't need you, but you somehow need them. And Jack was like that. Bobby was the guy who had to do all the dirty work for Jack. He was his enforcer. And Jack would say, you do it and keep me out of it. All these amazing things of backroom, strong arming. Go do it and keep me out of it. And Bobby would play the bad guy, and people blamed the messenger. But Bobby had a heart. Bobby really did care about people. He cared in a way that he tried to submerge, because the old man, who was an SOB, he didn't want him to ever show any niceness, because the old man didn't respect it. The old man, Joe Kennedy, you have 1,000 reasons not to like him, but one reason not to like him is he didn't care. And I'm not sure he was all that patriotic either. The kids were. Bobby was definitely a gut patriot. And so when it was called, in a sort of ethereal way, it was Jack. And certainly Joe Jr. was a patriot. They were willing to give their lives for the country, and they did it. And they just, in many ways, to make up for the old man. It was an anti-Semite, and I'm not sure that American. I'm tough on the guy. I don't like him. And I'm not sure the kids had to like their father, but mainly they're trying to make up for him. I really believe that.
So the book, I've read it already, I can tell you.
Thank you.
Traces all the great famous episodes in Robert Kennedy's life, many of which are moments of history that are shared with his brother, of course. So we go through, the book takes us through John F. Kennedy's elections in Massachusetts and eventually to the presidency. There's a lot on John F. Kennedy's presidency, including this great centerpiece, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which figures prominently in both the brothers' lives. John F. Kennedy's assassination, of course, then Robert Kennedy's ascension to the Senate and his presidential campaign cut short by his assassination in 1968. So there's a lot of meat in this book. But just for purposes of organizing our conversation here, Chris, how about if we talk about Robert Kennedy's intersection with various other personalities that loomed large on the stage at that time? So you already said something about his relationship with his father, Joe Sr. Let's take another Joe McCarthy.
Yeah. That was my favorite part of writing this book, trying to figure out his relationship with Joe McCarthy. And I have a feel for it. I like, the older I get, I like old guys. I like talking to them. I love Ben Bradley. I love hanging out with Ben Bradley. A guy named Sean Mount, an Irish guy. I just love old guys. I have a real affinity for them. Maybe because I figure I'll be an old guy pretty soon, and I smite you.
I've got 4 years on it.
Okay, so he taught my wife. That's how old he is at Stanford. Here he is, a kid just out of law school, UVA, and his father gets him a job with Joe McCarthy. McCarthy has just been named because the Republicans squeaked it in the 1952 election, thanks to the Eisenhower landslide. They picked up all the chairmanships of the committee after many years. And Joe McCarthy's now, after his 2 or 3 years since 1950 of his wild demagoguery, he's now chair of a major committee, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. This gives him the latitude to investigate any aspect of the federal government. It's an extraordinary committee, and he's the boss. So he hires Roy Cohn, a frightening figure, as his top guy. He had helped put away the Rosenbergs. And then he brought in Bobby as a favor to the old man as assistant counsel. Bobby immediately had a problem with Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was gay, and I don't think that was something Bobby liked at the time. And that was not the only reason he had a problem with him. He had his real problem with him. He thought he was jealous that McCarthy seemed to like him more than he liked Bobby. And he had that whole fight he had with his father figure again, like he had with his dad, favoring the other brothers. And then he noticed that Cohn was bringing McCarthy down, bringing him to ruin with this demagoguery, with the abusing of witnesses, the crazy trip to Europe where they went and burned all the books at the USIA headquarters. I mean, it's crazy stuff. All the time carrying on this crazy affair of some sort with David Schein, this very handsome young guy, wealthy guy that Roy had brought onto the committee. Bobby's watching all this. Well, Bobby's doing a good job. He's out there discovering that the British, through their shipping, are sending war materials, strategic materials, to the Chinese at the same time that we and the British are fighting the Chinese in Korea. It's one of the few things, as Doris Fleeson points out, the liberal columnist, that actually McCarthy did that was good for us to find out about. And Bobby quit. He thought McCarthy was going too far, warned him about Roy Cohn. He said, "You're killing yourself here." A few months later, John McClellan, the ranking Democrat on the committee, brings him back on his ranking as the chief counsel for the Democrats, and he goes to war for the next several months with McCarthy. We go through the Army McCarthy hearings. Joseph Welch calls McCarthy to account. Have you no decency? McCarthy is censured. Bobby writes the letter, or writes the brief, the resolution to condemn McCarthy for the Democrats. He turns on him, and all the time, he stays very affectionate towards McCarthy. And that's the part I wanted to find, the chilling ability to do the tough job against him, knowing he was wrong, knowing he was the bad guy, and at the same time, this tremendous affection for him. Kathleen told me about it. Ethel told me about it. They would go visit McCarthy with his young wife. He would grab Kathleen, who was like 1 or 2 years old, and say, "She's mine." I mean, the affection the families had for each other. Then McCarthy, after the censuring, drank himself to death. It took him 3 years to drink himself to death. He just systematically was killing himself. And all the time, Bobby's going over and seeing him. Even when McCarthy sits there in his stupor, Bobby's sitting there being very, showing regard for him and chatting with the young wife. And he would write in his diary, the guy's been drunk the last 3 hearings. And then the big moment comes in April of '57, and Kathleen told me she's with her father in the car. She's 6 years old, and her father gets the news over the radio that McCarthy has finally done it, what he wanted to do, kill himself with booze. And Bobby was so overwhelmed by that he drove around the airport 3 times. This was too much for him. And so when the 70 senators honored McCarthy's death in the Senate chamber, imagine that 70 men showed up for that. Bobby then snuck off to the funeral itself, to the burial in Appleton, Wisconsin. Didn't want anybody to know he was there. Hid in a car, and alone in the car, watching it so nobody would see him. He let a reporter let him see him, but he said to the reporter, "Please don't tell anybody." The reporter never told anybody for 20 years, just to show his respect for McCarthy. And the 2 brothers, Jack and Teddy, both said among the things they most respected about their brother was his courage and loyalty and going to that funeral. They said it took a lot, because Bobby had to do it in a way that wouldn't hurt his brother's chances for the presidency. It would kill him with the liberals. So he had to go and keep it secret so it wouldn't hurt Jack's chances, but he just felt this tremendous loyalty. And Teddy said it too right before he died, that that's what he was proudest of his brother. So it's complicated. I don't expect anybody to agree with my judgment about it, but I really get it. And I said, this is my way of finding Bobby's soul. One of the ways that says this is a real person who's not some Paul who just does everything for show and for reaction, that he actually had reasons for doing things that have nothing to do with anybody knowing about it. So it's one of the reasons I like him.
Let's talk about another of his fraught relationships with Lyndon Johnson.
2 dogs on a sidewalk. I like to sit on my porch in Maryland and watch people walk their dogs, and everybody does it on purpose. They always have to walk their dogs past each other. They never avoid it. I guess it's some kind of weird test, I don't know. And so, but the dogs bark at each other and they hate each other, and it was like that with Bobby and Johnson to the very end. And it started in 1940.
This is the part that actually I learned something about this.
Well, I got that bit from Robert Caro, because Caro's latest book, and Caro knows everything. If you want to know every inch of Lyndon Johnson's life, read Robert Caro. And I think he's turning towards liking him now, in about the 4th volume. Was in 1940, Lyndon Johnson, the young acolyte of FDR, is sitting next to Roosevelt, FDR, when he's talking on the phone to his ambassador, who he doesn't like, Joe Kennedy in Britain. "Oh, Joe, come on over tonight. We'll have lunch or dinner. Bring Rose. Can't wait to see you." And he gives an aside to Joe, "I'm going to fire this son of a bitch." And Johnson dined out on that for years, and Bobby heard about it. So when they come together in 1953 in the Senate cafeteria, Johnson's walking by very ceremonially, and Joe McCarthy and his staff are having breakfast, and Joe jumps up, Mr. Leader, and all that Senate stuff. And Johnson spots Bobby, who was not getting up. And this is what I heard from Larry King, the writer. Johnson could always spot the person that wasn't giving him attention. And he noticed one guy wasn't getting up, and it was Bobby Kennedy. He goes over and insisted on a handshake, and he gave him a fish, you know. Gave him a handshake of least regard. And Johnson walked over to George Reedy, his press secretary, and said, it's about 1940. Johnson knew what he had done. And it never changed.
That was 13 years after that.
And then, of course, yeah. And Johnson, of course, was the biggest guy in the United States Senate the whole time Bobby's working there, either for McCarthy or the Rackets Committee. The number one guy is Johnson. They were just the Kennedys are nothing compared to Johnson. But, you know, Johnson, when he finally comes out to L.A. for the convention, puts out the word that Bobby's father was a Nazi. He was an umbrella Chamberlain type who thought Hitler was great. He laid, like in a biblical way, threw it onto the sons. This is something that Jack Javits did in 1952 for Henry Cabot Lodge. Whenever somebody wanted to beat a Kennedy, they would blame the kids for the father, for being a Nazi. And it just tore at them. And it wasn't, not only, you don't have to be Irish to understand this. You don't want your father called a Nazi. And they did it, and Johnson did it, and he still, and a couple of days later, got the nomination for vice president from Jack. The difference between Jack and Bobby is Jack knew he needed Johnson. He didn't care a hoot about him, his soul or anything. He said, I need Texas, I need Georgia, I need some southern states. I'm going to pick this guy, totally out of utility. Bobby, who keeps score right and wrong, black and white, who's the good guy, who's the loyalist, who don't I like, would have never agreed with it. In fact, he spent a whole day, as I wrote in the book, trying to kill the deal. There's a great picture in the book, by the way. I worked so hard to get this book right, the pictures, and there's a picture of the three of them at the Biltmore Hotel in L.A., where Bobby's in the background just looking like, I hate what's going on right now. And Johnson, and Jack is literally holding LBJ's hand backwards, like one of these Hollywood handshakes, backwards, you know. And I go, Jesus, this is a great statement of what the thing was like. Jack did what he had to do, and Bobby never wanted to go along with it. And he never, of course, Bobby eventually wanted to be Jack's successor. And that obviously wasn't going to happen.
I think you get Joe Jr. right in a single sentence. You say he was not a Nazi or pro-Nazi, nor was he an appeaser. He was a defeatist. Yeah. And I think that's the most accurate summary statement you can make. And he wasn't alone in thinking that the Brits were going to be defeated. That was a widely shared opinion.
Sure. You know, Lindbergh thought that. Yeah. Lindbergh thought
George C. Marshall thought that.
Yeah, well, Sarge Schreiber was America Firster, too.
Yeah.
A lot of good people were America Firsters, but a lot of bad people. And there was Bund influence there, too.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
All right, let's...
The Bund was active in the America First movement, ironically.
Let's jump forward to another McCarthy, Gene.
Yeah. He loved Joe McCarthy and hated Gene McCarthy. And we grew up loving Gene. I don't know. I love Gene McCarthy. I loved him because, you know, he arrived in late 1967. I had first met him in 1964 at the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And I was a busboy.
You weaseled your way in?
I weaseled way. I was a busboy. I went to this. There was a party at the old Shelbourne Hotel there on the boardwalk, one of these grand old hotels. This is before gambling came into the city. And I saw these wealthy matrons or doyens or whatever coming out with money. They were all rich. And they all had these like $25,000 plastic tickets to go into the thing. And I just said, can I have your ticket? Come on. Okay. I finally got this wonderful older woman, not older, she's about 40. And she gave me, she was wealthy as hell, and she gave me her ticket. Why not? Here, she gives me a ticket. So I went, I had my blazer and my khaki pants. I looked like a rich kid. And I was bopping in there. I was shaking hands with Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson and Scoop Jackson. I knew every one of these guys. And finally, I shook hands with Gene McCarthy. He was overwhelmed that somebody knew who he was. Because nobody knew who Gene McCarthy was. He was just an unknown guy from Minnesota. So the reason he ran against Johnson is also very personal. In 1960, he, of course, gave the great speech in Los Angeles for Adlai. Don't turn your back on this prophet in his own land. an amazing speech. And you always wonder why he gave it. He liked Stevenson, but he also wanted to stick it to the Kennedys, and he was doing it for Johnson. That's what I always thought. To keep the camp, to prevent a first ballot victory by the Kennedys. But what really got to him about Johnson, who had always served on the finance committee, and that was always the knock on Gene, that he was helping out the oil industry all the time and to keep in with Johnson and the people that were financing him. He gets word that Johnson's trying to figure out a scenario. In fact, he has a scenario for picking vice president. Since Johnson didn't have the amendment to the Constitution, he didn't have a vice president after the assassination. He was just president, and that's what it was. So he's going to pick a vice president in Atlantic City. To keep the convention exciting, he's going to keep it secret. And here's his plan. He's going to take the 2 top contenders for vice president on a helicopter with him, fly to Atlantic City, and touch down like he's Bert Parks, and decide, and at the last minute, go up on the platform and have the first runner-up, just like a Miss America, give the nominating speech for the new vice presidential nominee. And when McCarthy got word that he was going to be the first runner-up, that his job was to arrive in a plane as a wannabe and have to stand there like a fool, having been beaten out by Hubert Humphrey, he said, this man is a sadist. And he refused to do it. And on the other hand, Bobby Kennedy was asked by Johnson, would you put Hubert Humphrey's name, would you put one of the guys in the nomination? He said, as long as it's not McCarthy. This thing went, in the book, I begin the story of these people, the dramatis personae back in the 40s when they first come in. Gene McCarthy comes in as a guy fighting the Popular Front, the real hard left in Minnesota. And he was a liberal, but a liberal, positive guy, anti-communist. And he was like a ADR type of person, Americans for Democratic Action, ADA. He was a moderate, he was a liberal anti-communist, and he was fighting the Popular Front, real left, and he won that way. It's a fascinating story because he became a really kind of a intellectual, philosophical Catholic who really understood the social welfare philosophy of the Catholic Church. And Bobby got into that at the end, too, the Dorothy Day Catholic worker thing. Leo XIII's encyclical, Rerum Novarum, about all the good New Deal things for the working people and opposing child labor, all the good stuff of Social Security and all that stuff was actually put together by Leo XIII.
And Michael Harrington, who wrote The Other America, which brought the poverty issue to the public's attention and the Kennedy's attention, had worked with Dorothy Day.
Yeah, they were all part of it. And one of the things Bobby was trying to figure out at the end of his life was what is the religious engine that drives these people in their work? What makes Dorothy Day Dorothy Day? What religious impulse? And what makes Cesar Chavez, what makes him so committed religiously to helping his people? Well, how does religion work together with good works and purpose? And he was really trying to figure this out at the end. And you're right.
How about Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, he thought Hoffa was evil. And Hoffa was mobbed up with the pension fund. And he first heard about this with Ed Guthman. And he went out west to Seattle. And he got involved going after Dave Beck, who was just a crook, head of the union. And then he saw the worst guy coming along, and that's Jimmy Hoffa, who was a mobster, killer. And so he tried to bring him down. He tried. But Hoffa was so tough. He was just really a tough guy. And he never could get him for perjury. He just kept pounding away. And he finally got him in the early 60s. And by then, Bobby had begun to move on. Bobby had stopped thinking about, at some point, stopped focusing on villains, because he thought, I believed that they would create their own hells on earth, like they all do, and end up focusing on the victims. That's all he changed. It was a nuanced change, but he did. Yeah. He didn't care when Hoffa finally went down. He was already beyond that.
I'm going to go to questions.
But there's some great characters in it, like Frank Kildorf, the arsonist. Did you read about him? Mm-hmm. He's the arsonist who ended up, in his last act, burning himself up. And he's lying on the gurney, and he's he's just a crisp. He burned himself practically to death. And then I guess the priest, not the priest, he sounded like a priest, the cop who had brought him in went to him and said, you're about to meet your maker. Why don't you come clean? The guy goes, F you, you know. These guys were tough characters. There was a guy, Johnny Dio, LaGuardia, who was the guy that threw the acid in the face of Victor Rizal, the great labor reporter. that my dad always respected. Even my dad was Republican. He always looked up to Victor Rizal because he took on the labor unions and they threw acid in his face, and he still kept writing. Now, there's great stuff in there if you want clean unions and if you don't like crooked unions. That's what he did, Bobby Kennedy.
About Fidel Castro.
Well, he wanted to get rid of him.
Yeah.
And the one moment when here's the sociometric overlay, which will drive you crazy. Here's Bobby spending his life from 57 to 63 or so going after mobsters, chasing bad guys. Let's put the name of Sam Giancana on the list, the godfather, the successor to Al Capone in Chicago, the guy who put his victims on meat hooks like Lee J. Cobb and on the waterfront. They put him on meat hooks, who was a hitman. And Bobby would tease him in hearings. You know, he'd start laughing. He said, "I thought just little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana." Right to his face, to a killer. But as he and then when he became AG, he had Mort Kaplan, who's his professor at UVA for tax law, and he had him agree that he's going to use the IRS to go after the bad guys, like the way they got Capone. And so he brings him in, and I've interviewed Kaplan. He's still practicing law in Thomas Circle in D.C. He's about 102. Amazing guy. He's got a bow tie and everything, goes to work. And so he got a list of all the time. It was after the Appalachian meeting, that great moment when they saw the mobsters in their black cars all meeting. It was in The Godfather. They were all meeting, and finally they said, there is a mafia, I guess, because they all know each other and they're all hanging out together. Hoover didn't believe in the mafia. He was still chasing communists, which is okay, but there weren't as many communists as there were mafia people. And but Bobby went after. He wanted a list of every top mafia figure, including Giancana. He wanted to know how to get each one of them, and he was going to use the IRS to get them. At the same time, a little conflict works its way into his life. It turns out that the CIA was using Giancana to kill Castro. So he felt he was being double-crossed because Bobby kept going after him. And what am I doing this for the government for? He refused to take the $150,000 they offered him because he wanted the government to owe him. That's why I figured he just kept turning down the money. Giancana turning down the money. What's that about? So what else? Oh, Jack's screwing his girlfriend. Jack's having sex regularly with Judy Campbell, who's Giancana's girlfriend. Is everybody crazy? Yeah. I mean, what are they thinking? Why would you mess with the mobster's girlfriend? What are you, crazy? Jack was reckless. What else? Oh, yeah, when they went to West Virginia, Joe Kennedy, the old man, asked for money from Giancana to help him win the West Virginia primary. I thought he did the euchre him in, just so that he would be part of the Kennedy operation. So all the time, Giancana is feeling double-crossed, welched on. So Bobby's the good guy. He had to go and tell his brother through, let's see, the first time, he said, you got to get rid of Sinatra, first of all. You got to end up all mob connections. Sorry, Jack. Sorry, Johnny, this guy's trouble. You got to get rid of him. And he got to do it. He got his brother to kill some. He was going to go out to Palm Springs and hang out with Sinatra one weekend. He got to not only to call off that weekend, but he was going to spend the weekend with Bing Crosby instead. And Bing Crosby's a big Republican. And Sinatra had built a heliport for the presidential helicopter to land there. And when he got the word that Kennedy was not only not coming, but he was going to go to Sinatra's place because he decided he was too dirty to hang out with, he goes out there with a sledgehammer. This is Sinatra, pounding away, breaking up the concrete on his helipad. So he was making an enemy with that guy. And of course, they're using the CIA to go after Phyllis McGuire's boyfriend, Dan Rowan. It gets very complicated. Anyway, Bobby's trying to deal with all this. He says, you got to break your relationship with her. Although finally, he sent his top aide to go send that word to Jack. You got to break off your relationship with Judy Campbell, who was a Jackie lookalike, actually, beautiful woman. And then you got to get rid of Sinatra. And then he found out that he finally gets to the point where he tells the CIA, if you're going to keep hiring gangsters, at least let me know. It wasn't like he was appalled. He just said, this is really too much and too complicating for me. So he had he had a lot of enemies, Bob, because he was the good guy. He was Michael the Archangel with his swift sword, taking on Jack's girlfriends. I mean, not the girlfriends, but the boyfriend of the girlfriend. It was tough. It's all true.
You had a little bit of I'm going to call it a speculative discussion on the air with John Meacham here a week or two ago when some new Kennedy assassination papers were released.
Yeah.
And if I remember it correctly, either you or he or both of you did a little speculating about how all this complicated backstory about the mob and the Cubans and Operation Mongoose and so on may have somehow afflicted Robert Kennedy's mind after the assassination of his brother.
This is so tricky. We've got a guy on tomorrow night on the show, Vincent DePiero, who was the guy that held Bobby after he was shot. He stood there. He's a waiter at the time, 19-year-old guy, a waiter in the Ambassador Hotel in L.A. And when he was right in the line of fire, he could see Sirhan shoot 78 bullets. The only one is he didn't hear this. He couldn't see the third because Bobby put his hands up and he couldn't see the 8th bullet. But he was right there. These people love conspiracy theories. There are people that don't want to accept the facts. Bobby thought it was the Warren Commission. He said it very clearly. He said this guy was a misfit. He was antisocial. He took it out on the president. I've seen all the evidence in the archives. I believe it was him. Teddy said that right before he died. He wrote, "My brother believed it, and I believed it. We believe Lee Harvey Oswald killed Jack Kennedy." But of course, if you begin through the experiences he's been through, it doesn't surprise me that somewhere in the back of your mind, rattling about of your mind, is maybe something was there. Ted Sorensen believed that Bobby could never quash the idea that somehow there was some blowback here from something, because of all the enemies he had. He had the Castro people as his enemies. The guy was a communist. Harvey Oswald had tried to shoot Edwin Walker, the right-wing general. He had tried to shoot Nixon, according to his wife's testimony. She had to lock him in the bathroom to keep him from going out that day when he thought Nixon was in town. He was with the Fair Play for Cuba. He was infatuated with Castro, disillusioned with the Soviet Union. To me, it fits. One thing I got out of the papers was I stayed up till late one night when they first got out, and I came across a piece of paper. It was a source explaining.
The newly released
Yeah, Jack Ruby. I just wondered, how the hell did Jack Ruby get in the police station? What the hell is he doing hanging around? He's a bar owner. And according to a source, the reason he was there is he had a good in, was the phrase, a good in with the cops, because I don't know whether he was paying them or not, but he's getting protection from the cops. He ran it. In the 1960s, there was something called B-girls. Now, they weren't prostitutes, but they were, I guess, attractive women who would, in these sleazy bars, guys would come in alone, and they'd come up to them and say, "How you doing?" whatever, and can you buy me a drink? And the guys would buy them watered-down drinks, and the place would make money. It was not the worst sinning in the world. It was just company, and the guy was making the money. Well, the police they protected him. And they said, and he had a good relationship with the cops in Dallas, and that explains why he can walk in armed and hanging around when they're bringing back the #1 criminal in the world by him, and he just happens to be standing there, and then he kills him. I just wonder, what are you doing here? But apparently he just had an in with the cops. It wasn't some big, complicated conspiracy theory. But look, everybody's open to conspiracy theories. I always said, well, give me some evidence, Give me some evidence. Yeah. Because I don't mind everybody thinking. But in the end, if you don't accept the evidence, then you got, to me, a problem. I mean, you got to at some point say, look, reasonable doubt, it's probably him. And I understand why Johnson wanted the thing calmed down, because at the time the Cold War was so hot, and he didn't want people thinking it was the Russians. Yeah. I mean, that could have caused trouble.
Chris, this is the time in our program here when we take some questions submitted by people here in the audience. And the first one I'm going to give you is one that I think goes to the heart of the biographer's art and the most difficult kind of interpretive or judgmental task that you as a biographer of Bobby Kennedy had to do. So here's the question. What convinces you Bobby Kennedy's compassion and ability to empathize and moral depth was authentic and genuine, given his reputation as ruthless and his family background?
His family background? What does that mean?
I've just read it.
What is this, is this the Old Testament here? Jesus, his family background.
How about we stop at ruthless?
I'll start with ruthless. I think the early pattern of his life was sweet. His father, a friend of the family, Lem Billings, said he's so generous. And the old man said, I don't know where he got that from. The old man had no respect for his natural generosity. He would hang out with his best friend at school. He's very democratic. His best friend at school was a townie. And they talk all the time about the poor people and what we can do for them. He was always, as I said, the Father Feeney story, the Ralph Bunche story. When Ralph Bunche He wanted him to come speak at UVA, and all the white Southern kids who wanted to be big career people down in politics wouldn't go along with him because he's black, even though he had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so Bobby fought so he would be allowed to speak before an integrated audience, and he went right to the president of the university. He got it done. He had very good signals in the beginning of a guy who was a good liberal, in the best sense of the word, cared about people. And then he became a jock, because his father wanted to see that. He became a jock, and we all know you put together entitlement and oafishness, and you have a hell of a recipe for obnoxiousness if you went to college and remember what they were really like to hang around jocks. And whether the team wins or not, you got to put up with them. And he was one of them. He became a real jock, and his father loved it. And he got a letter in football, even though he had a broken leg, and then he became his brother's tough ramrod campaign manager in '52 and got him elected. There's no doubt Jack wouldn't have won without him. He put it together. He was tough. He was tough going after the rackets. He was tough when he ran his brother's presidential campaign because it was for his brother. As Ethel said, he loved his brother. And his brother asked him to do something, he'd do it. Anything to help Jack. He loved him. And he didn't do this stuff for himself. He did it for his brother almost all the time. So he was a tough, ruthless guy for the right causes. When he got into the civil rights fight, he was on the right side. He had to learn. People like James Baldwin had to teach him, and Harry Belafonte, and people like that, John Lewis, all respected the fact he learned. He became a real champion of civil rights. And the same with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He learned and found the peaceful route to avoid a nuclear war. So I would say on every matter of values, he ended up learning to do the right thing and did it, and became much more of a, and after his father had his debilitating stroke in late 1961, he became much more the original Bobby. And then when Jack was killed, he became even more the original Bobby. So I see a pattern of sweetness, tough ruthlessness for his brother, and then back to the real Bobby the last 5 years, or last 6 years, 7 years. I think there is a pattern. I do believe people are complicated. This is not, a morality play. This is about a real human being. And I find it wonderful that a real human being would grow to be the guy that he became, this champion for the overlooked. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact he was overlooked as a kid. It comes back to, like most of us, we never get over being who we were when we were 5 or 6 years old. And I think that it's a good question, by the way.
Let me just ask a kind of parenthetical question here about the Cuban Missile Crisis. If I remember correctly, in Michael Dobbs' book, 1 Minute to Midnight, about that crisis, where he excavates a lot of the Miller Center transcriptions of the recordings made of the XCOM and so on, that one of Bobby Kennedy's first remarks, and might have been the very first day of the crisis, he said, "Let's make a Maine out of it." In other words, let's resurrect the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898, which was the excuse for the war against Spain. Is that an accurate report?
Well, it's worse than that. He was with LeMay, bombs away, and then, he and his brother's much more sophisticated about it, recognized that Khrushchev had warned Kennedy, if you go after Cuba, and it would be an attractive thing for us to do, to grab a communist country right on off our southern shore. He said, if you go after, I'm grabbing Berlin. And we all knew if he grabbed West Berlin back then, it was going to go nuclear because we had about 1/10 the forces on the ground that the Warsaw Pact had, that we would be overrun in hours if we didn't go to tactical nuclear. And so Kennedy could not afford to have that chain reaction start. If I go there, they go there, like they did when the Brits and the French and the Israelis did that horrible Suez campaign. They gave the Russians cover for grabbing and crushing the Hungarian revolt. You don't want to give the Soviets cover in the international press because they will act. And but then Bobby was given the job by Jack. You got to cool these people down. They're all going. They all want to go to war. People like LeMay, General LeMay, and McGeorge Bundy even. So Bobby said, after listening to Dean Acheson, we got to go bomb them. Bobby said, we're not the Empire of Japan. We're not the Japanese Empire. We don't believe in sneak attacks where we kill thousands of people just because we're to have a little worry about what they're up to. They got the wrong guy. And this is before W, of course. We used to have this value. We don't attack just because somebody has some arms. And so he said, this isn't us. This is who we are. It was the moral argument. We're not going into Cuba and just kill thousands and thousands of Cubans just because they happen to be in this geopolitical fight. They don't know anything about it. And anyway, I think he really moved from being the hawk to the dove. And I think that was a big part of his growing up. And it's a pattern I've noticed in almost every part of his career. He grew from the instinctive Mick who just wants to fight to this guy who understands consequences and who shows values. And I think it was a really, personally, I think the best thing Jack Kennedy ever did was tell the generals in the CIA in the Bay of Pigs, oh, you guys thought I would go in? You guys think you tricked me into this? No, I'm not going to invade. And they wanted him to do it. And Bobby stood up against him, and he came up with two things. He had to deal with Bolshakov, his Soviet-backed channel connection, and he told Bolshakov, how about we'll get the weapons out of our weapons, our nuclear missiles out of Turkey to give you guys cover to cut a deal. Bolshakov, a couple of days later, all of a sudden Khrushchev sends a second message. Now we want the missiles out of Cuba. You can say that Bobby gave them the argument, but he also gave us the way out. And Khrushchev comes off looking pretty good. Because Khrushchev, first of all, Harold with Bill in it, the Prime Minister of Britain, is watching all this, and he refers to the Kennedys as two great men. He knew Bobby was in there. And then, of course, that wonderful moment when Dobrynin comes in to see Bobby at the Justice Department after it's all over the next day, when we've saved the world, basically. And he says, I want to give our best wishes to you and your brother. It was a magic moment in history. And a friend of mine, Army Bernstein, who wrote the movie or produced the movie 13 Days, he'd been over to see Castro, and Castro said, yeah, I always liked Bobby. And the thing is, he said, those damn Russians made me take those offensive weapons. I should have never done it. They should have just had defensive weapons. But the offensive weapons that could reach here. That's what the weapons are. Anybody thinks that Castro was just playing defense? No. The weapons he was accepting were intermediate range missiles. And those weapons are capable of reaching every American major city except Seattle. That's what they were putting. This was to change the strategic balance between Moscow and us. It had nothing to do with Castro. The Russians were using the Cubans. And Castro, looking backward, said, that's what caused us to go through that humiliation. But Khrushchev, in the end, saved the world. He said, we're not going to do it. It cost Khrushchev his career, but he said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to push the button on the world. It's a good thing. So we had leaders like that in the world, like Kennedy and Khrushchev. We don't have them now. We have Trump and Kim Jong-un. And that is a frightening situation. They are not totally responsible leaders, to put it lightly.
We're going to come back to the present moment.
No, we're here. We live here. This is where we are.
In this conversation.
David, we're here. This is frightening.
I
live on a
that.
planet with these
I'm
two guys.
About our conversation.
These cartoon characters. Jesus.
So,
What do you do?
So you've already touched on this, but I think it's worth revisiting and give you another chance to talk about this. The questioner says, I was struck by your book's cover. What was it about RFK that made him embrace black Americans at a time when many were marooned by white segregation and poverty?
Well, I think it was being one of these kids himself. I think look, it's my premise, it's a conceit, whatever it is, it's my belief, my proposition that we are who we grew up. And if you're the kid that's left out all the time, you're the kid discarded by your father, you do develop, if you're good, some sense of what that feels like. And you get a sense of what it means to be discarded, overlooked. It's a friend of mine I was in a Peace Corps with used to say, he talked about women actually at the time. He said, people don't mind being used, they mind being discarded. It's so true. Discarding is the worst thing you can do. And that's why the white working class are so angry at the Democrats right now, because they feel discarded. There's no doubt in my mind. Bobby wouldn't discard them, and that's what showed he didn't. That's my favorite picture in this book. It's on the back, beautifully photographed, and it's a poor family, very poor, not working class, a white family, with a guy who's obviously had some military experience, is an enlisted guy with that crisp salute. His son looks like a lot of us growing up with the shirt off, dirt all over us. The poor wife, clearly in the background. They're showing a patriotic affection for Bobby Kennedy. And of course, they were intermingled with all the African Americans along the rail route from New York to Washington, where there was like 20,000 African Americans singing, because they do know the lyrics. The African Americans do know the lyrics to these songs, so they sing them, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And they did it all spontaneously. So you had maybe the last American politician who could, I'm not saying these people are hanging out with each other, but they both had the same regard for him, white working class and African Americans. And it was, I think the greatest tribute to him is that he could do that. Nobody seems to know how to do it now anymore. I mean, Obama, I loved Obama, but he got a little aloof at the end. He got more and more aloof. And there are other people. And I think Bill Clinton had a bit of this with all his flaws. I think Bill Clinton could connect with people pretty well. But I think Bobby had the true patriotic affection. They looked at him as not a political leader, but a patriotic leader. And I think that gut patriotism, the Democrats aren't comfortable with it. I think we miss it. I miss that, you know. The Reagan Democrats went off their way, and the Trump people went off their way because of this, and I think in the case of Trump, false nationalism that masqueraded as patriotism. And I think the Democrats they gave it up. They said, okay, you guys can go be with him. I don't get it. It's just unbelievable what they did. And it's going on now for decades now.
So, Chris, here's another question that obviously comes from somebody with some historical knowledge, and I'm going to dilate the question just a little bit. The questioner says, or asks, in 1978, Arthur Schlesinger wrote Robert Kennedy in his Times. What difference have the intervening 39 years made in your own perspective compared with that of Schlesinger? And let me add to that Evan Thomas.
Yeah, they're both the best two books that written. Evan's written was about 2000. They're fantastic books. And in fact, Evan, I say that I made his book my scaffolding. I worked on that scaffolding from where he was. I tried to add all that I could about the Irish Catholic experience and trying to figure out the family's soul and Bobby's growing up, but adding to a lot of historical fact that Evan has. He's a great journalist and reporter and historian. Schlesinger was obviously very close to the Kennedys. A beautiful writer. My God, he's a beautiful writer. And I just think I've added to it because we know more. And I think that it's string collection, as we say in journalism. You're constantly collecting string. You're constantly learning new stories. I knew stories that Arthur Schlesinger did not know. I knew that Bobby Kennedy was the only Democratic senator who would regularly say hello to the Capitol Police. The only one that took time to say, how you doing today? Instead of just walking by with this snooty attitude like, I've got the big picture in my mind, I can't deal with you. Bobby was like that, and I got that from a number of people. His connection with people. I don't think they caught that soulful quality of the guy. I mean, Ethel once said to me when I interviewed her, she said she loved it when I said Jack had the charm and Bobby had the soul. And I think that's true. That's a little less fine writing perhaps than Schlesinger, who said the romantic and the realist, but charm and soul is pretty good. Bobby was not charming, but he was soulful, and you could trust him.
So here's a question that I'm sure not only on the mind of this questioner, but a lot of people's minds, including yours. What kind of president would Bobby have made?
Well, I think the war would have ended sooner. And I think we've never been able to, the series wasn't it unbelievable? The documentary, I mean, was just beyond belief. I watched it all, and I want to watch it again the rest of my life. Maybe 5 more times I'd like to watch it. And everything, Peter Coyote's narration, everything was just what it told us about Nixon when he got in there in '69, how he and Kissinger, whose celebrity escapes me, how he just continues to be a hero, and how they sat in the Oval Office and talked about how they're going to sacrifice lives of servicemen and Vietnamese lives so that they could have another term, and actually saying it in the room to each other. I mean, talk about cynicism. I'm just saying, we're going to sacrifice a couple more years of this hell so we can get another term. That wouldn't have happened. I mean, my first time I ever voted was in '68. I was already in Peace Corps training down in Louisiana. And I voted for Humphrey, but I did it with no confidence that Humphrey would get us out of the war. I thought he'd keep Johnson's war going. But I did because of civil rights, and he is great on civil rights, and because of Ed Muskie was a fabulous running mate, I thought. I ended up working for him for 3 years. But I thought Nixon, I thought, would just take us out of the war. I didn't vote for him, but I thought he'd just say, Democrat war, I'm getting out of here. He didn't. No. And I think that's one big change. And I think the war was the beginning of this terrible gap between left and right, and then it led into Watergate, which was very much a part of the Vietnam experience, as you know. They're all connected. The plumbers, all that stuff was all coming out of that. Secrecy.
Whoever thought that history would bring us to a place where some of us would be nostalgic for Richard Nixon?
Well, after you. I don't know. I mean, Nixon looked so bad in that documentary. I mean, really, he looked worse than Johnson. Johnson looked flustered. Nixon looked conniving, and oh my God, it just And anyway, that began the whole thing. And the hard hats versus the long hairs, we went through all that. All that went on. And that sort of class thing between the working guy and the better off middle class, that fight, I don't want to knock it too much, but the Archie Bunker thing of looking down on the white working class, that whole thing began, that riff, that gap hasn't been closed. It's gotten worse. And so Democrats have Carole King concerts and enjoy themselves and celebrate how great they are and the elite. And they just love how far they've come and all this, and all the working class. What's this? Is this a party? I never got invited. And I'm sorry nobody wants to hear this, but it is true. And the blacks and the whites in this country, the working class people, should be in the same political party. That's what I believe. And they've been driven apart by cultural issues and snobbery. And I think that's something that's got to stop. Because if the Democrats want to win elections again, they better reinvite the white working class back into the party, or you're going to lose again and again and again. It's true.
So, Chris, when I told somebody I was interviewing you this evening, they said, well, that's going to be the easiest interview ever. You just have to say, Chris, what's on your mind, and sit back. And they said, that guy didn't just kiss the Blarney Stone. He must have French kissed it.
One of the things I try to teach myself is not to react to stuff like that. I did it today on Ron Owens, and I just jumped on somebody because that's what I do. But I'm not going to do that. Because you taught my wife, and she thinks you're great, and Kathleen thinks you're wonderful, and you look very young for a guy who taught my wife. But
So we have time for one last question, and so little time that I urge you to be concise.
Sure.
And maybe it's just a single name. The question
here
asks,
it comes.
who is your most memorable politician?
Oh my God. I think I'm out promoting a book I love and worked my heart out on. I think it's still Jack. I think Jack was. I think to meet him and actually have some time back and forth with him, it'd be a little scary because he wouldn't need you at all. He wouldn't need you at all. That's a little scary, to be in the company of somebody who has absolutely no need for you to exist on this planet. But to be his friend must have been something. Guys like Ben Bradley and Charlie Bartlett, I interviewed all those guys, Chuck Spaulding. I interviewed all those guys. I've had at least that connection with Jack, and they are misty-eyed talking about him. And they don't understand him. They just said he was a wonder that he existed. And Chuck said, when you're with him, it was like being at a fair, like a World's Fair. Everything was just fun. And he wasn't a good guy about people, women. He was pretty much utilitarian, but he was a charmer when he was with them. I think when he was around, he was great. I mean, they all liked him. And he was wonderfully charming. George Smathers said to me, the most charming man I ever met, and these are tough customers, and it was just something else. And nobody can explain him. I mean, I did know Mimi Fonstock, that 19-year-old that he just took around on the plane with him all the time as his babe. And she was great, and I think she loved him. And what can I say? He was lovable. And I think he's still the most charming guy you'll ever meet in American politics. I mean, it was all fun. He was having fun the moment he was killed. He was riding in that car, his beautiful wife, having the time of his life. People were cheering him. And all of a sudden, it's gone. And he had that quizzical look on his face that his wife said he always had when he was trying to figure out something complicated. He just realized both these guys knew what happened to them. Both guys knew at the end what happened to them. They weren't knocked out. In that split second, they knew what was going on. Jack had the shot in the neck, and he got the shot. He knew he was being assassinated. Bobby knew it. He said, is everybody else all right? And that was just a great Bobbyism. Is everybody else all right? He's got a bullet in his head. And I'll tell you, that was to me the great statement of his generosity. It's all true.
Chris Matthews,
it's all true.
Author of Bobby Kennedy, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.